most for body weight. So Kevin, welcome. The audience is yours.
Thanks very much, David. And it's too bad it couldn't be in person, but this will have to do, I guess, until a future event sometime when things return to more or less normal, hopefully sooner rather than later. But let's just jump into some of this with respect to counting calories as an approach to achieve weight control. As late as a couple years ago, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a viewpoint article that basically said that the way to kind of think about this is that if a patient reduces their caloric ingestion by 500 calories per day for 7 days, she or he would lose about 1 pound of body weight per week. And this is based on the so-called 3,500 calorie per pound rule, which if you Google how many calories does it take to lose a pound, and you'll find, 7 million hits kind of referencing this rule, which is many, many decades old, and dietitians have continually tested on this idea of how calorie intake and body weight are related to each other. But it turns out that unfortunately, this rule of thumb, as widespread as it is just plain wrong. And it doesn't take much thinking to realize that it's got to be at least somewhat incorrect, because if you imagine a 100-kilogram man who's burning and eating about 3,000 calories per day to maintain their usual weight, and you cut 500 calories out of their diet so that they're now eating 2,500 calories per day, this rule of thumb would predict that that man would disappear in 4 years. That clearly doesn't happen. So something is wrong with this relationship between calories and weight that has been around for decades and decades. And the thing that's wrong with it, primarily, there are several things, but the biggest thing that's wrong with it is that it presumes that calorie intake and calorie expenditure, or calories in and calories out, are independent quantities in such a way that if one was to cut calories in the diet, nothing happens to the number of calories that the body burns. And therefore, to conserve energy, and I'm a physicist by training, so I believe in the law of conservation of energy, then you have to extract the missing calories from the body to make up that energy deficit. And that's what leads to the linear rate of weight loss that was plotted in the previous figure. So it's not true that calorie intake and calorie expenditure are independent quantities. In fact, these are quantities that are related to each other through a series of parallel negative feedback loops that regulate body weight in a way such that if you manipulate calorie intake and you cut calories in the diet and begin to lose weight, various factors kick in, including the hormone leptin will go down, which is secreted by fat cells in proportion roughly to the amount of body fat that's on the body. And that will act to increase hunger, increase appetite, as well as suppress calorie expenditure. And so a lot of my work over the past several years at the NIH is coming from a quantitative perspective in trying to build mathematical models of the relative feedback strengths and these parallel negative feedback circuits that regulate body weight. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, it's a whole other talk, but just to suffice that one of the things that we've worked out is that when people lose weight, their calorie output or their energy expenditure goes down by about 25 kilocalories per day for every kilo of weight that's lost. And on the opposite side, appetite goes up by about 95 calories per day for every kilo of weight that's lost. We kind of traced out how we figured out the appetite side of the equation in this paper in obesity. I don't really have time to get into it, but what I'd like to tell you about is how these two parallel dynamic negative feedback circuits play out when someone actually tries to change their lifestyle to lose weight as part of, say, an intensive lifestyle intervention program. So here's an example of a really interesting lifestyle program that was actually part of a study called the Calorie study, which was sponsored by the National Institutes on Aging. And the idea here was to take a group of overweight men and women and put them on a 25% calorie restricted diet for 2 continuous years. So the idea was take these folks who are overweight, put them on 25% calorie restriction, keep them at this 25% calorie restriction level, and see what happens to a variety of outcomes. Here I'm just plotting their weight changes and their body fat changes in the black circles and green triangles respectively. The curves here are our mathematical model simulations. And so I think what you can see is that this intensive calorie restriction intervention that basically involved meetings and individual counseling for 2 continuous years in an attempt to achieve 25% calorie restriction, what you can see is that people lose weight relatively quickly initially, and then they sort of plateau after about a year, and they don't really lose any more weight after that period of time. In fact, there might be a hint that there's an increase in weight over the second year of this intervention. One of the things that's rare in nutrition science and in metabolic science in people who are doing these very long-term studies is to try to accurately measure energy intake, the calorie intake side of the equation. But this study went to great expense with a lot of money to do what's called the intake balance method, where they give repeated doses of doubly labeled water, which is a couple of stable isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen, and measure their energy expenditure, as well as by looking at their body composition changes, trying to figure out how much calorie intake was changing over time. And what I think you can see here in the boxes, and by the way, this is the only time that this has been done over anything like this extended time period, and it costs about $1,000 a dose of this doubly labeled water, so it's extraordinarily expensive. But what they observed was kind of interesting, was that despite them these folks engaging in this persistent and intensive lifestyle intervention, you can see that the energy intake in the blue curve here decreased substantially initially by about 25%. 700 calories per day would constitute about 25% in this group. But there was this sort of exponential decay of diet adherence, so that at 12 months, they were eating about only 300 calories per day less than they started. And the curves, the orange curve, which is the energy expenditure curve, was equal again to the energy intake curve. And that's the point of that plateau where weight loss is no longer occurring. And again, the simulations from our model are in the curves here. And so, for a long time, this sort of pattern of energy intake changes decaying over time, is it just that these people are going back to their old ways? Is their old habits kind of are they just not sticking to the program anymore? Well, clearly they were not able to achieve the 25% calorie restriction. That's clear, and the authors of the article for the primary paper clearly stated that. And I think that it's interesting to try to interpret what's going on with that energy intake curve in the context of that negative feedback circuit that I discussed before. Because as these people lose weight, their appetite is increasing above baseline by about 95 calories per day for every kilogram of weight that they lost. So all we needed to do was take a look at their weight change, which was in 2 figures ago, and you could see that they were losing about 10 kilos of body weight. And so their appetite is increasing by almost 1,000 calories per day above where they started as they lost the weight. And so what their body is telling them they want to be eating is that dashed blue line. The fact that they're eating according to the solid blue line suggests that they are instituting a persistent and substantial effort to stick to this program, but they just end up fighting a greater battle as their weight loss occurs. And so what I think that this kind of tells us is that it's not that people are not sticking to their diet program on purpose, or that they're somehow slipping in their efforts to adhere to a lifestyle program that's causing them to reduce calories. It's that they're fighting a greater and greater battle against the negative feedback circuit that is increasing their appetite as they lose weight. And I think that's a little bit of a different way to think about what's required clinically for people to both lose weight and, perhaps more importantly, keep the weight off over the long term. Long after they've stopped losing weight, they still need to maintain this constant and substantial persistent effort to keep the weight off over time. And this is something that I think thinking quantitatively about these dynamic interplay between these 2 negative feedback circuits is we're beginning to better understand really why it is so difficult for people to lose weight and keep it off. But of course, it would be great if we didn't have to cut calories from our diet. And maybe Dr. Atkins was right all along. Back in the 1970s, he published his first edition of his Dr. Atkins Diet Revolution book, promising wonderful effects of low carbohydrate diets. And in fact, the subtitle of that book was the high calorie way to stay thin forever. And the basis there was not to focus on cutting calories, not to focus on restricting the number of calories in your diet. Maybe you could even eat more calories if you just focused on changing the composition of your diet. In particular, if you were to cut carbs to a substantial degree and increase fat in the diet, then perhaps what could happen is that your body might burn many, many more calories. In fact, it's been postulated to be several hundred more calories per day on a low carb diet. And therefore, you might not even need to cut calories at all, and you would still achieve a negative energy balance. In other words, a deficit of calories being taken in the diet compared to how much you were burning. And again, you would have to remove that body fat stores in order to basically keep up with that energy deficit. And this idea has kind of continued. More recently, David Ludwig at Harvard University, who also has a diet book based on this idea, has kind of put this in a more theoretical construct about how the food environment may have generated obesity and why low carb diets might be particularly beneficial. And that model is called the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And the basic idea of that model is that if you want to understand why people get fat, then you need to understand the biochemistry and endocrinology of how adipose tissue regulates fat storage. And one of the things that we know very well is that insulin plays a very important role in both inhibiting lipolysis, or the breakdown of triglycerides inside adipose tissue and release to the circulation in terms of free fatty acids and glycerol, as well as regulating how much fat is being taken up by adipose tissue by stimulating lipoprotein lipase and shuttling the free fatty acids into the adipose tissue and storing it. And so we've known this for decades and decades, that insulin plays a dominant role in regulating lipolysis and uptake and storage of fat. And the observation then is that the amount of carbohydrate in your diet also very much plays a role in how much insulin is being secreted. So that if you are eating a very high carbohydrate diet, you will tend to secrete more insulin that will cause more fat to be directed towards adipose tissue for storage. That will basically result, according to this model, in a decrease in circulating metabolic fuels like glucose and lipids that are available for lean tissues to consume. And what that does is it basically sends a signal to the brain that you don't have enough metabolic fuels. You should increase your hunger and maybe depress your energy expenditure in order to save calories, this sort of starvation signal. And the way that Dr. Ludwig describes this is he says that a high carbohydrate diet produces a postprandial hyperinsulinemia that promotes deposition of calories in fat cells instead of oxidation in lean tissues, and thereby predisposes to weight gain through increased hunger, slowing metabolic rate, or both. And so according to this model, it's not violating any laws of thermodynamics or violating energy conservation. It's just that the direction of causality is opposite to the way many people think about what's driving obesity. In other words, causality is moving from the right to the left in this diagram, as opposed to from the left to the right, where a surplus of energy intake or a reduction in energy expenditure is pushing excess calories into fat tissue. So this is a very interesting model of how body fat storage might be regulated, and it makes certain predictions that can be tested in experiments. In particular, if it's been hypothesized that if insulin is playing this really dominant role and carbohydrate is driving insulin in terms of its role in fat storage, then maybe you can't lose body fat unless you also reduce insulin secretion. And therefore also reduce carbs. In fact, Gary Taubes, a science writer, has kind of made this suggestion. He says that any diet that succeeds does so because the dieter restricts fattening carbohydrates. Those who lose fat on a diet do so because of what they are not eating, the fattening carbohydrates. The basis of this claim is that Gary has said, maybe what's happening even when people lose body fat on a low-fat diet is that they're also cutting carbs from where they started. And how do you know that somebody who has lost body weight and body fat on a low-fat diet lost it because of the cutting calories that they experience, or versus the cut in the carbohydrates versus the cut in the fat that they achieve versus baseline? Well, the only way you could really test this idea or know for sure is if somebody only cut carbs from their diet, keeping fat and protein at baseline levels, versus only cutting fat in the diet, keeping carbs and protein at baseline levels. And nobody had done that experiment before until we decided to do that at the NIH Clinical Center several years ago, where we brought in 19 men and women with obesity, and they stayed with us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a pair of 2-week periods. And in one occasion, we only cut carbs from their diet by about 30% of their baseline calories. So that's the blue bar here, almost 800 calories a day cut from carbs. And I think you can see that we basically did not change fat or protein intake at all. And in random order, they either received that diet or the reduced fat diet, which is in the red bars here, where we cut the same number of calories from fat, keeping carbs and protein at baseline. And so if the carbohydrate insulin model is right and the corollary of Gary Taubes is right, only the reduced carb diet should lead to a substantial reduction in insulin secretion. And therefore, only that diet should lead to a loss of body fat. And potentially, that diet should increase the number of calories that the body was burning in order to according to that carbohydrate insulin model, because you're releasing the fat from the fat cells where it was previously locked up. Whereas the reduced fat diet should lead to no significant differences in insulin secretion, and therefore keep the fat on the body because insulin would stay high. So what happened? Well, indeed, only the reduced carb diet in these same men and women with obesity resulted in a substantial reduction, more than 20% reduction in insulin secretion throughout the day. And the way that we measured this was, again, these folks are staying with us continuously for these pair of 2-week periods. We measured C-peptide in their urine, their 24-hour urine collections. And C-peptide is a molecule co-secreted with insulin on a 1-to-1 basis. But unlike insulin that's cleared by a lot of tissues in the body, C-peptide is really only cleared by the kidney in the urine. So by basically measuring how much C-peptide is in the urine each 24-hour period, you have a measure of the daily insulin secretion. And you can see these same men and women with obesity in random order, only the reduced carb diet led to a reduction in insulin secretion, whereas the reduced fat diet led to no significant differences. As David mentioned in the introduction, we have a few respiratory chambers here at the NIH where we can bring people in and they can spend various periods of time inside these chambers where we measure their oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. And in the days prior to the onset of the reduced carb or reduced fat diet, which happens at time 0 here, we measure the ratio of the CO2 production to carbon dioxide, to oxygen consumption, which is an index of what fraction of fuels are being burned. In other words, a higher number means that a greater amount of their energy expenditure is coming from burning carbs. A lower amount means that it's coming from burning fat. You can see over the period of time immediately before the reduced carb and the reduced fat diet, the 24-hour respiratory quotient is something like 0.86, 0.87, meaning a mixture of fuels are being burned. And interestingly, when the reduced carb diet is introduced, because insulin secretion is going down, relieving the inhibition of lipolysis, you can see that what happens is that greater, and I can tell you free fatty acids go up in the circulation, and the body shifts more towards burning fat. That's the blue curve going down and seeming to plateau after several days. Is shifting towards burning more fat. So this sounds all good for the carbohydrate insulin model because, again, the prediction was only the carbs, reduction in carbs in the diet would decrease insulin secretion, which would relieve the inhibition of lipolysis, providing more fat for the rest of the body, to burn, and therefore shift towards this fat burning mode. And indeed, that's what we observed in this study. However, on the reduced fat side of things, we cut fat from the diet in an equal number of calories, keeping carbs constant. Nothing happened to insulin secretion. Nothing happened to free fatty acids. And the body kept burning the same fraction of fat as it did before. But of course, burning more fat doesn't necessarily mean that you're increasing your fat loss. In this case, it does. You are burning more fat on the reduced carb diet, and you haven't changed the amount of fat that's come in. And so therefore you go into a deficit. But on the alternative, the reduced fat diet, you're not changing the amount that you're burning, but you change the amount that was coming in the diet. So you also will lose body fat. And so what we can do is figure out what the cumulative fat change was in these two periods, which were isocaloric. And it was in fact the reduced fat diet that led to statistically significantly more fat loss compared to the reduced carb diet, despite having no changes in insulin secretion. Now, I would say that these differences that we're observing are clinically meaningless differences. They're very, very tiny. They could only really be observed in this setting where we keep people locked up for days at a time and feed them every morsel of food and track every morsel of food that they eat and calculate these balances extremely carefully. But I think what you can see is that the direction of the change in fat is opposite to what was predicted by the carbohydrate insulin model. And indeed, the only way you can get even these very small changes is to account for the calories. The little extra calories had to come from somewhere. And indeed, they came from energy expenditure. And it was only the reduced carbohydrate diet, again, that was predicted to increase energy expenditure. Here, that was the only diet that resulted in a decrease in energy expenditure in contradiction to the carbohydrate insulin model predictions. So when we published that paper in 2015, the low carb community got really angry with me. I don't think they've ever forgiven me. But Mark Hyman in particular from the Cleveland Clinic was writing a book based on the carbohydrate insulin model called Eat Fat, Get Thin. And he devoted a couple of pages of his book saying what the problems of our study were. The main points are that he didn't think that we had enough reduction in carbs to really cause something meaningful. And he said, this is really only a very short study. In fact, this theme of needing to do longer studies has kind of progressively kept going. And the idea here is that maybe if we just waited a little bit longer and given the body enough time to adapt to the higher fat, low carb diet, that we would have seen a further decline in the respiratory quotient, indicating greater fat oxidation in such a way that you may have caught up or even exceeded the net fat balance that we observed with the reduced fat diet. So I can't rule that out. That's certainly, the data looked to me like it was plateauing after the 6-day period on these two diets. But of course, we don't have data past 6 days in this study to comment on that. It may or may not occur. But we did do a subsequent study, this time where people spent 2 months continuously with us at the clinical center on the ward, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We fed them all their food. For the first 4 weeks, they were fed a high carb, high sugar diet. And then the second period of time, we kept the number of calories constant, but shifted them to a very low carb, 5% of calories from carb, 80% of calories from fat, a so-called ketogenic diet. And so here the idea was, okay, let's give people a full 4 weeks to adapt to this ketogenic diet. And at the end of that time period, we will measure in the respiratory chambers over 2 continuous days how many calories they were burning. And we will compare the energy expenditure during those 2 chamber days with the last pair of chamber days on the baseline diet, where they're eating the same number of calories and the same amount of protein, but obviously much more carbs and much more sugar. And so that was the idea of this study. And then we also had them spending 2 days every week inside these chambers. So what did we find in this study? Well, at time 0 here, you can see that, again, there's a big shift towards a major decrease in C-peptide excretion in the urine. So upwards of a 50% reduction in insulin secretion, which again, I have to keep reminding myself, that this reduction in insulin secretion is really interesting to me. I mean, it's a major change that basically says that people do not require as much insulin to maintain their blood glucose levels, which is why I think that many people are excited about these ketogenic diets for treatment of type 2 diabetes and maybe even type 1 diabetes. You just don't need as much insulin to regulate glucose when you're eating very, very little carbohydrate. And so clearly here we saw that effect, 50% reduction in insulin secretion. Now, none of these people had diabetes, but some of them were insulin resistant, and yet you don't need very much insulin to regulate glucose when you are eating a very low carb diet. And indeed, these men went into ketosis quite rapidly, and it was persistent over the course of the 1 month on the ketogenic diet. During the respiratory chamber days, you can see that the respiratory quotient again shifted more towards fat oxidation, but you can see that the shift occurred all within the first week. In other words, there wasn't the predicted nosedive that was suspected if people got used to this high fat, low carb diet. Now, of course, I can't rule out that this might not have another nosedive after 28 days. It certainly could. But again, we don't have any data supporting that in this particular study. So what happened with our primary outcome? Well, again, the primary outcome was the last pair of chamber days on the ketogenic diet after a month on the ketogenic diet compared to the last pair on the baseline diet. And there was no statistically significant difference in 24-hour energy expenditure. So again, not supporting this effect of a metabolic advantage of very low carbohydrate diets in this particular study. But of course, we could look at each of the chamber days that weren't just the last pair of this for this particular hypothesis. And when we did that, we saw something that was kind of interesting, and that was that early on at the transition towards the ketogenic diet, in that first week or so, we actually did see an increase in energy expenditure that then petered out over time. So it wasn't that we had to wait longer to see the effect of the ketogenic diet. It happened very early, and then the effect seemed to dissipate over time. And why would that happen? Well, it's not exactly clear, but we can come up with some hypotheses. And one of those hypotheses is that when we actually look at the nitrogen excretion data, you can see that, again, just to remind you, the amount of protein in the diet was kept constant. But what we saw was that on the transition to the ketogenic diet, nitrogen excretion went up. So in other words, we're basically catabolizing a little bit more protein, probably for gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis costs ATP. And so one hypothesis is that increased gluconeogenesis that's required early on in the transition to a ketogenic diet causes the initial rise in energy expenditure. Of course, losing some of that protein in the body actually might impact body composition changes. And indeed, we saw early on a suppression in the rate of fat loss at the onset of the ketogenic diet, so that the loss of body fat upon transition from the high carb, high sugar diet towards the ketogenic diet actually slowed down somewhat in the first period of time, but then seemed to pick up towards the end as protein catabolism started to normalize. So these are two studies that we have bearing on effects on energy expenditure and body fat, which seem to counter the predictions of the carbohydrate insulin model. And so what we did was a systematic review and meta-analysis of all of the human controlled feeding studies that have been conducted, where they kept the number of calories constant, and kept the amount of protein constant, but varied the ratio of carbohydrate and fat. And in 2017, we published this meta-analysis, and what we found was a highly statistically significant difference in energy expenditure, favoring lower fat diets, not lower carbohydrate diets. But I would argue again that this statistically significant effect is physiologically meaningless. It amounts to about 28 calories per day. So my interpretation of this is that we and others have varied the amount of carbs and fat in the diet by huge amounts, keeping the calories and protein the same, and yet we can detect maybe very small effects, but the body does a pretty good job of maintaining the same amount of energy expenditure. And similarly, when it comes to body fat changes, isocaloric diets, controlled feeding studies, varying carbs and fat by huge amounts, keeping protein constant, you can see a slight benefit, highly statistically significant benefit for the lower fat diets. But again, clinically meaningless difference of about 16 grams per day. So I think that's kind of interesting. And it's amazing how the body can adapt to these very large swings in carbs and fat and yet not change the energy expenditure very much at all, or change the rate of body fat. Of course, there's another side of the carbohydrate insulin model, and that's the energy intake or appetite or hunger side of things. And of course, all of the effect could be there. So we were really fortunate because we had just completed a study on this just before we got shut down in March, where we brought 20 men and women into the NIH Clinical Center. They spent 28 days continuously with us. And in random order, they were either put on a 10% carb, 75% fat diet, or a 10% fat, 75% carb diet, and then switched after 14 days on each. And in this case, we presented them, they didn't know what the primary outcome of the study was. We just said, we want to see how these different diets affect your body. They were wearing loose-fitting scrubs, that they were informed this wasn't a weight loss study. And we provided them with double the amount of calories that they would need to maintain their weight, but just gave them very basic instructions of eat as much or as little of the food that we provide to you. And tell us when you're done, and we'll take your plate away. And what they didn't know is that we were measuring their leftovers and calculating exactly how much they'd eaten on these 2 periods of time. And so what we did was we based these 2 diets on a non-starchy vegetable intake, or non-starchy vegetables in the diet were common between the 2 diets. And then we added animal-based products to basically mimic what's typically recommended for a low carb ketogenic diet. So on the left here is an example of a breakfast, which is a veggie scramble with cheese. In the middle is a steak salad for lunch. And on the right is a zoodle like pasta made of zucchini noodles with a meat sauce and a side salad. And so this is what 1 day of a animal-based low carb diet. Again, this would get you 10% carbs, 75% fat, 15% protein. On the other side, we did a plant-based low fat menu. So on the left is a breakfast of quinoa blueberry cereal. In the middle is I guess it's a black bean stir fry. And on the right is a pasta dish with primavera sauce. So again, the amount of non-starchy vegetables common between the 2 diets, but in this case, a 10% fat, 75% carb diet. And so what we were interested in doing was maximizing differences in insulin secretion. Because again, it's this idea that postprandial insulin, which is going to be driving this hunger late in the postprandial period and therefore increasing subsequent hunger. And we were choosing relatively high glycemic foods in the low-fat diet. And what you can see here is in response to these meal tests, these same individuals, again, in random order, when they received the low-fat meal, you saw a much larger increase in glucose and a much, much larger increase in insulin. In fact, 3-fold larger postprandial insulin secretion. When we measured urinary C-peptide over the course of the diets, in fact, it was 60% higher with the low-fat diet. So huge increases compared to the low-carb diet and insulin secretion. And again, we talked about why that might be interesting for glycemic control in people with type 2 diabetes. Again, none of these people, these 20 men and women had type 2 diabetes. And also over the second week or over the first and second week of that period, blood ketones were much, much higher on the low carb diet. So clearly a ketogenic diet. So again, the carb-insulin model would predict that the high glycemic load and the high insulin secretion of the low-fat diet should lead people to be hungrier because you're trapping those fuels in the fat tissue. and thereby leading to increased hunger and increased energy intake. Whereas the low carb diet keeps insulin levels low, keeps glucose levels low, increases ketones, which is also thought to suppress appetite. So what happened? Well, unfortunately for the carb-insulin model, people ate about 700 calories a day less on the low-fat diet, despite these very high insulin levels on that diet. It happened in every single subject. So it's the same direction in every single subject. It's very rare to see that kind of result. I was very surprised by that. Usually there's a little bit more variability in the response, but in our hands, everybody ate less on the low-fat diet compared to the low-carb diet. People didn't report any differences in hunger, satisfaction, fullness, or eating capacity on the two diets. They also didn't report that they liked any diet more than the other. And they also didn't report that the foods were any more or less familiar. The latter is not surprising because we excluded people that wouldn't be familiar with about 75% or more of the foods. We didn't want to have the sort of a neophobia effect. And the pleasantness, we try to make all of the meals as pleasant as possible because the last thing we want is to have people drop out of the study because they don't like the food. And so, not surprisingly, people lost more fat, body fat on the low-fat diet because they were eating 700 calories per day less. And in fact, on the low-carb diet, they didn't lose a significant amount of body fat over the course of the 14 days on the diet. But interestingly, they lost a lot more fat-free mass on the low-carb diet, primarily body water, because you're mobilizing glycogen, and glycogen is associated with water. You're losing some extracellular fluid because the insulin secretion goes down, and that has a diuretic effect. In fact, when you look at weight loss, there's faster weight loss on the low-carb diet, but again, they're not losing a significant amount of body fat. So I think clinically this is kind of interesting, right? Because this could be very motivational for people to stick to a low carb diet because they don't know how much body fat they're losing. And they might, and in this case, they were eating many more calories. They're eating 700 calories per day more than they were on the low fat diet. And yet their body weight is being lost quite dramatically over the course of these first 2 weeks, which might be very motivational for people to stick to these kinds of diets, especially when they step on the scale and see this kind of effect. So, I've been kind of showing you some data that has been kind of bearing on this, what seems to be a very long-standing war between low carb and low fat diets. And, I'm kind of getting sick of it, to be honest with you. So it occurred to me a while ago to think about, what do, advocates for both low carb and low fat diets, what do they kind of have in common? And I talked a little bit about that because they both recommend that you eat a lot of non-starchy vegetables and kind of base your diet on these non-starchy vegetables, eat a lot of them. And they also tend to tell people to kind of stay away from the processed foods that are kind of ubiquitous in supermarkets. I've just kind of took a picture here of a freezer aisle in a supermarket where you have a lot of these ready to heat or ready to eat foods that are basically contain, a lot of artificial flavors, some emulsifiers, and have been prepared in ways that would not kind of resemble your home kitchen preparation. In fact, people have correlated the rise in what are called ultra processed foods in the food supply. Here are some Canadian data showing that it's contributing in more recent years, more than 50% of calories in the food supply come from what's called ultra processed foods, whereas people are purchasing many, many fewer culinary ingredients, and they were cooking much less than we did in the past. And one of the things that, I was skeptical that processed foods was, really a problem, but it turns out that, these ultra processed foods tend to be higher in salt and sugar and fat, and they also tend to be lower in fiber. And so there's this cadre of nutrition researchers who have now said, let's not even focus on nutrients. Let's focus on ultra processed foods as the basis of categorizing foods and whether or not we should be eating them. But when I would ask those folks, okay, well, what is it about those foods that cause people to overeat? They would say, oh, well, they're high in salt, sugar, and fat and low in fiber. And it struck me as odd because those are a bunch of nutrients. So is it the nutrients or is it something else? And so we decided to do another trial. Again, very similar in design to the last study I showed you with the low carb and low fat diets. Again, people spent 4 weeks with us continuously, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Same sort of design. We give them double their calories that they would need to maintain their body weight. Again, tell them it's not a weight loss study and simply say, eat as much or as little as you want. In one case, the diets are coming from, on the left, more than 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods. And on the right, 0% of calories from ultra-processed foods and 80% or more calories coming from what's called unprocessed or category 1 NOVA foods. So there's a NOVA classification system, and we basically use that to categorize these foods. And we match the presented meals in terms of their calories, the carbs, the fat, the sugar, the sodium, and the fiber. And again, 20 adults came in, they didn't have diabetes. They were instructed to eat as much or as little as they wanted. And again, the same primary outcome, mean daily energy intake differences. So what did we find in this study? Well, it turned out that people ate a little more than 500 calories per day more on the ultra-processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet, despite being matched for all of those nutrients. They didn't report any differences in hunger, fullness, satisfaction, or eating capacity. And they also didn't report any significant differences in pleasantness or familiarity of the foods. Unlike the previous study where everybody lost weight, in this case, the ultra-processed period of time, people gained weight, whereas in the unprocessed period, they lost weight. And that was also reflected by the changes in body fat. So people on the ultra-processed diet, they were gaining body fat, and when they were on the unprocessed diet, they were losing body fat. So this study, more than any other, has been the subject of much speculation, and I would say has been a little bit of a Rorschach test for folks when they interpret this. A lot of people have very strong opinions about what was causally responsible for the effects that we saw. And it ranges from anywhere from people saying, oh, well, the microbiota is responsible because they're seeing some effect of emulsifiers in the ultra-processed diet, to protein intake being, or protein content of the diet being very, very slightly different between the two diets. I'd say there's a whole host of potential hypotheses that we need to track down to see now to figure out what is the difference between these two diets. One of the leading hypotheses, I would say, probably the leading hypothesis, is that the number of calories per gram of food was very different between the two diets. And this kind of goes back to Barbara Rolls' idea of energy density playing a major role in determining how many calories that we eat. And so despite the fact that the energy, the macronutrients were very similar between the two diets, the energy density or non-beverage energy density of the ultra-processed diet was much higher than the unprocessed diet. And that's really because of ultra-processed foods tend to extract the materials from the foods from their natural sort of food matrix, and they end up extracting a lot of water. And as a result, you get this concentrated form of calories. And that's normally kind of what you would see with a very high fat diet, because fat obviously has more calories per gram. In fact, interestingly, our low carb diet in the previous study was actually slightly higher in energy density compared to the ultra processed diet, and again, there they did not gain weight. They actually lost weight, and although they didn't lose body fat, they certainly didn't gain body fat. So energy density might not be the entire story here. And in the low fat diet, it was actually quite well matched for energy density compared to the unprocessed diet, but people lost more body fat on the low fat diet than they did on the unprocessed diet. So comparing across studies suggests that energy density might play a role, but it might not be the whole story. But nevertheless, we've designed a new study, which is a 6-week inpatient random order crossover feeding study in adult volunteers without diabetes. There'll be 3 test diets for 2 weeks each, matched for the presented calories, carbs, fat, sugar, sodium, and fiber. One will be very similar to our old ultra-processed diet with a high non-beverage energy density. The other will be very similar to our old unprocessed diet with a low non-beverage energy density. And then we've reformulated a new ultra-processed diet that's low in non-beverage energy density. And so the idea here is, again, to measure daily ad libitum energy intake over 2 weeks on each diet. And we hypothesize that if energy density is playing a big role, that the ultra-processed high energy dense diet will be greater and replicate our previous findings than the unprocessed low energy dense diet, and that the ultra-processed low energy dense diet will be at least intermediate, but if it's actually not significantly different from the unprocessed diet, then maybe energy density does play the dominant role here. And so we had hoped to be doing that study right now. We've been a little bit slowed down, but the hope is to begin recruiting folks early next year. And who knows, maybe a couple years from now, I'll have a chance to come up in person and tell you the results of this study. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the folks who have been contributing to these studies over the years, especially the volunteer study subjects who, again, stay with, give up weeks of their life to stay with us, have us poke and prod them and feed them all of their food. The nursing staff at the NIH Metabolic Clinical Research Unit, and my various collaborators and trainees over the years. And with that, I'd like to stop and take some questions if there's time.
Terrific, Kevin. Thank you very much. I have some questions, but let's open it to the floor first.
I have a question. Dr. Hall, thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Nina Rosano, and I'm an endocrinologist who takes care of diabetes, and I run metabolic weight loss clinic at UMass. I really appreciate all your work through years, and it really helps me to guide my clinical work with patients on diet and counseling about weight regain. So I really appreciate what you do, because I definitely reflect all what you're saying in my practice. My question is not reflecting physics at this point. I know you work primarily focused on a caloric intake and dynamic of energy changes, but on endocrine part of it, as an endocrinologist, I am concerned about few things that drives people metabolic changes, which is ghrelin, leptin, and obviously POMC, because I do those tests and I found that people do have dysfunction of ghrelin. People do have a leptin resistance, and when I check genetic tests for obesity, majority of people end up with some polymorphic abnormality of POMC. How this current stage of obesity research affects your work, and what do you think about those 3 points I mentioned?
Yeah, so those are great questions, and thanks for taking a lot of the things that we've been saying into the account in your practice. It's interesting. So something that we haven't published yet, but we're in the process of finalizing the manuscript, is we in addition to the meal test looking at glucose and insulin in the low carb and low fat diet studies, we also looked at active ghrelin, total ghrelin, GLP-1, leptin, PYY, a variety of kind of appetite regulating hormones. And what we were kind of surprised at was that they were, number one, had significant differences between the diet groups, but they were in exactly the opposite direction that one would predict based on how people ended up eating the food. In other words, the low carb diet, if you just looked at the differences in ghrelin and ghrelin and GLP-1 and PYY, for example, they would predict that people should eat fewer calories on the reduced carb diet. So the hormones were saying, you know, in the direction that we understand them, they would have predicted the opposite effect of what we actually observe. So what that tells me is that while they may play a very important role, they're clearly not the dominant role over the course of at least the 2 weeks of our study. So I think that we can't ignore them. And I think that, you know, they may play a very important role in some people. And I think that really gets us to the next question, which is, why do some people seem to respond so well to one diet over another in a kind of a clinical setting? Whereas, you know, we may or may not see that in cases where we really control the food environment and they really don't have access to other kinds of foods. So I think that there's a lot of open questions there. And what you're highlighting is that, yes, there's genetic differences that may explain some of that individual variability. And unfortunately, we just don't have answers to that at this time. But it's certainly something that we're interested in. Right now, unfortunately, because we have to have this level of control over people, because we can't, once they leave our facility, we can't accurately measure what they're eating. And we can only really keep 2 or 3 or 4 people at once. Our studies are typically quite small. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out ways to kind of increase the number of subjects that we can study so that some of these genetic factors might be able to be more reliably addressed. But right now, we just don't have the ability to kind of crank up the numbers as much as we would like.
John Mortis, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yes, well, I'd like to make a comment first that I find these extraordinarily interesting studies. And for somebody who's been at UMass for a long time, they're in the tradition of J.P. Flatt, who was a nutrition and diet investigator here for many years.
Yeah.
And I'm pleased to see the tradition continuing. I had 2 questions. The first is based on my clinical experience, where I have had uniform failure in generating diet-induced weight loss in my patients with diabetes, unless they add a physical activity component to what they're doing. And I'm wondering if in the course of your studies, you've been able to determine or speculate on the importance of physical activity in addition to dietary manipulation in the factors that you observe. David and Michael Check had brought in a number of people over the years who have shown that physical activity makes profound changes in some of the enzymes associated with intermediary metabolism. And the second question was, you showed this interesting little tidbit in one of your slides where despite there being insulin resistance and a high carb diet, insulin resistance can go down dramatically. And I was wondering if in your models you have anything that can help account for this thing that we observe often, which is take a diabetic with high insulin resistance and high insulin levels, hospitalize them for 24 hours and their insulin requirements plummet.
Yeah, so great two questions. With respect to the first, in all of our inpatient studies, we require that people do a constant amount at a constant wattage of exercise. The main reason for that is to avoid them becoming completely sedentary. And so, in fact, one of the things that was kind of surprising in our ultra-processed food study was that we expected that this, you know, because these folks were gaining weight and gaining body fat, that they would become somewhat insulin resistant. And we would see that in the oral glucose tolerance tests and applying various modeling-based methods. And we actually saw no hint of an effect between the 2 diets. And one hypothesis is that that may have been because they were exercising for 60 minutes every day, which may be more than they're used to in this particular case. So in some sense, exercise can be potentially protective, even if you're eating an ultra-processed diet that's causing you to gain weight and gain body fat. And something I didn't talk about at all today was we did this crazy study on The Biggest Loser contestants, which was this television show which involved extraordinary amounts of exercise, along with a crazy diet for these folks to kind of lose enormous quantities of weight over a relatively short period of time. And we followed these people up 6 years later, in addition to studying them during this competition. And indeed, Actually, it was interesting because during the weight loss phase, physical activity or changes in the energy expenditure in physical activity was not at all correlated with the amount of weight loss. It was all driven by diet. But 6 years later, the exact opposite was true. Diet didn't explain any of the variability in the ability to maintain weight loss, but it was very highly correlated with the physical activity changes. In other words, people who had increased and maintained the most increase in physical activity were the best able to keep the weight off over the long term. And I don't think we fully understand the reason for that yet. It may be because if you're increasing your physical activity, then you don't have to cut your calories as much and you don't engage this negative feedback circuit of appetite to as great of a degree. But that's just a hypothesis. But I think that we need to better understand the relationships between physical activity and body weight regulation. And what the interesting part for me was that that relationship shows up very late in the game, not early in the game during active weight loss. With respect to this business about insulin resistance changing quickly and dramatically when people are kind of in a metabolic ward and subjected to those kinds of conditions, yeah, it's interesting. Again, we didn't do clamps in our studies, so we don't have the gold standard methods for measuring insulin resistance. But you're right, it does seem like especially in the low carb diets where insulin requirements go down substantially, glucose levels are hardly changing, right? These are relatively normal glycemic folks to begin with. They might be slightly hyperglycemic in the pre-diabetic phase, but insulin secretion is going down by a huge amount. Whether or not that really translates to a clinically meaningful difference in insulin resistance and how that's defined, I think is sometimes we're a very glucocentric world when it comes to insulin resistance, is I think questionable. One thing I didn't show in this particular case was that after the 2 weeks on the reduced carb versus or the low carb diet or low fat diet, we did oral glucose tolerance tests there, and as has been documented many times before, when people were on the low carb diet, they became glucose intolerant. But it was not because they became more insulin resistant. It was because their beta cells had, I guess, potentially because they're not used to secreting much insulin, they didn't respond to this huge insulin load. And so that's our interpretation. They'd adapted to the low carb diet. Their beta cells were nice and relaxed. They didn't need to secrete much. And when you challenge them with 75 grams of glucose, they were like, what the hell's going on? We can't deal with that right now.
Nutrition makes thermodynamics look easy.
Yeah.
It's 1:15, so I think we have to end it here. Kevin, that was terrific. Rich Perugini, I see you unmuted. Did you have a quick question since you're a weight guy?
Oh, yeah. The ironic question from the person who's a bariatric surgeon is, I think you showed a great slide with regards to weight loss and why it's such a poor metric for what exactly is going on in patients, right? So when people lose a lot of fat-free mass, I think your interpretation was that they were losing fluid, and I think we see that. Do you have any concern that people are losing muscle mass as well? Because when, again, we're stuck with, what is somebody's weight ahead of time? What is somebody's weight afterwards? If people are losing muscle, I know we're making them unhealthy, right? And that's something we definitely want to avoid.
Right. So it's a good question. And in the low carb diet case, I didn't show it, but they also do go into negative nitrogen balance, which suggests that they're losing protein. But again, and probably primarily from muscle. But I think the point, an important point to consider is that, people with obesity don't just have higher fat mass, they also have higher fat-free mass. So whether or not that's functional and to what extent it's really damaging them for them to lose some fat-free mass and some muscle mass is, I think, not well understood. It's probably, obviously you want to preserve it in older people. You want to avoid sarcopenic obesity. I think that it's always a good idea to kind of put people on a resistance exercise program to try to maintain muscle mass and strength as they're losing weight, especially in older people. Again, what the heck do I know? I'm a physicist by training. That would be my thoughts on the matter.
All right, well, we're gonna have to end it here now, but Kevin, that was terrific, and we will get you back sometime when we can actually get you up here. I'd
Sounds
also
good.
like to invite you to a Levine Symposium to debate maybe David Ludwig. Have you ever done that before?
Oh, yeah, I've done it several times.
Yeah, so it'll be fun, you know,
Yeah.
it's so hard to know exactly what's going on, but you did it a very thoughtful presentation, which we appreciate.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody. See you,
Bye-bye.
Kevin.